Hello, I'm Peter Chestnut, member of the Senior Lawyers Division, and I'm here to conduct an oral history of Terry Revo, member of the State Bar of New Mexico. So let's get started. Terry, where were you born and when?
I was born in Niagara Falls, New York, and stayed there for about 3 years, and then my parents moved to Buffalo, New York.
And what did your parents do for occupation or living?
My mother did not work. My dad was a salesman.
Is there anything about your childhood or early adolescence that influenced the direction of your life?
Is this a therapy session? Yeah. In 7th grade, we had to write a paper, a report, kind of something like that, about what we wanted to be or who we wanted to be, what we wanted to do when we grew up. And I was looking through some of the books and I came upon attorney. And I read it a little bit and I said, that's pretty interesting. And I know my folks knew a number of people who were attorneys. So I went home and I talked to them about it, and they told me that they thought that was a good idea. And I told them I wanted to be a criminal defense attorney. And so, you know, that happened in 7th grade. And something else happened along about that time that made a difference. I'm Jewish, as you well know. And at 13, we have something called a Bar Mitzvah, which historically meant that when you went through your Bar Mitzvah, you were accepted into the community as a grown-up adult man. Has a different meaning these days. But what you do is you study some Hebrew, you have a portion from the Torah that you memorize or read, and then you have to give a speech. And I gave my speech, and afterwards, several people from the audience came up and said, you know, you ought to be a lawyer. And some of those people I knew were lawyers. So I figured, okay, that's cool, I'm going to be a lawyer.
All right. Were there any professors or other role models that inspired you to implement that thought of becoming a lawyer?
You know, that's a tough question because there's so many people that you come in contact with. There was a guy who ran the clinic portion of our clinic course, you know, the get up and talk portion. And he was just amazing.
Was this at law school?
No, this is, yeah, when I was in Buffalo. And George was just amazing. And, you know, I thought, wow, if I could do what he does, that'd be great. And I don't know whether I've ever gotten to that point, but I was motivated by him.
Did you work outside the field of law, either before or during law school?
Oh yeah, I started working at about 12 years old. I had a paper route. I sold a bunch of things door to door. I worked in a shoe store, or in a department of a large store, shoe department. And I worked in drugstores. And that was pretty much all through college. You know, I remember sometimes feeling pretty bad that I had to work on a Saturday when everybody else was at the football game. But that's what I did, and you know, I made some money and it felt good to do good work and be compensated for it.
Let's see.
I mean, there's more to that. Because
Okay.
I just, there are, you know, I'm going back to George and the standard that he set.
In the clinic?
In the clinic. And then there was the lady who was really in charge of the clinic, and she was very helpful to me. She actually allowed me to take a vacant attorney's position because she thought that there, over the summer, because she thought that their program was going to be defunded. And so this lady, Penny, said I could step into that attorney position as long as I didn't go around telling people that I was an attorney. And so I took that job. And that led into a few other things that were crucial to my life's development.
What kind of cases were you working on?
In the clinic, it was mostly low-level misdemeanor cases in city court. I'll tell you a quick story about my first case. I go over there and I'm all nervous and everything, and it was a sentencing time for a guy that was convicted or pled to a DWI. So I went over and I met the guy, and he just reeked of alcohol. And I go, oh my God, what am I gonna do? So I figured we needed to stand close enough to the judge so that the judge understood what was going on. And I made my presentation, and he sentenced him and kind of winked at me. That was one of the interesting times back then.
Well, you were there in Buffalo before you came to New Mexico. Did you, as I recall, wasn't there a prison out there? Did you get involved with that at all?
Yeah, what I just said is a good lead-in to that part of what I did. The job that I got over the summer was in the Prisoners Legal Assistance Project. And that project was funded after the Attica riots. And the idea was that there would be attorneys who would go out to the prison and interview the inmates who had claims that they weren't able to resolve on their own. And it was mostly administrative work. And the way I learned how to do it is my first day on the job. They said, you go out to the prison with Bob and look what he does, and that's what you're going to do. So I said, okay. I go back the next morning and said, well, okay, what do you want me to do? And they said, well, there's the filing cabinet. Pick the first 10 inquiries and call the prison and tell them you want to see these guys starting at whatever time it was. And I did that for 2 years. And in that 2-year period, this was starting before I graduated law school and after, I represented about 1,000 guys. And it was mostly administrative stuff, like they weren't getting the right good time. They wanted to be transferred from one block in the prison to another block in the prison. They weren't getting furloughs. They weren't getting the courses, because they had educational courses. People used to come to the prison. So it was mostly administrative stuff, and I'd talk to the person, and then I'd go talk to the lady who was the assistant warden, and negotiate with her to see what I could do to help these guys get what they wanted. And during that 2-year period of time, the judge, who was a county court judge, and what used to happen is they used to load up the prisoners in a bus and take them to the county courthouse, and then guard them there, and then guard them on the way back. And the judge said, this is really foolish. I'm going to go to the prison and hold the hearings. And they were mostly mandamus hearings. And after a while, the judge got to know me. And he said to my supervisor, Danny, he said, why don't you let Terry handle some of these cases? And I said, well, Judge, that's really nice, but, I'm not admitted. And he said, well, it's my courtroom, and as far as I'm concerned, you can try these cases. And they were all mandamus cases. And he said, but I want to make sure that one of the other attorneys was in the courtroom at the time. And it worked out that way. And I did a number of those mandamus cases, and they were actually fun. Because, it's kind of a little anti-authority thing. So I did that program for 2 years.
So did that continue after law school?
Yeah, I worked for a year after law school, and the program closed down because they did actually lose their funding. And then I opened up my practice out of my dining room in Buffalo, New York. And back then, Buffalo was was a city, and it was surrounded by a bunch of small towns. And each of those towns had their own court. So we were able to pick up low-level misdemeanor criminal cases and go to a court on Monday night and another one on Tuesday night and that type of thing. And we got paid, or I got paid, $10 an hour for time outside of court and $15 an hour for any time I spent in court. And in addition to that, there were mental health cases that could be assigned. And then there were guardianships that could be assigned. So I volunteered for all of those different programs. And it was one of the guardianship issues that I was working on. And when the case was resolved, my attorney on the other side said, "We got a position in my law firm. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Yeah." And so I went to work in that law firm. I stayed there for about 15 months. And I was a low guy on the totem pole. So I got to do everything. I got to do divorces, criminal defense, insurance defense, personal injury, plaintiff's work, real estate. I did a lot of real estate for them back then. And that coincided with the time that I decided to come to New Mexico. My bosses told me that I had 2 weeks of vacation, and I needed to use it or lose it. So Marty and I were not married at the time. We were living together in Buffalo. And I came home and said, "I got 2 weeks vacation. What do you want to do?" And she said, "I don't know." And she was working. She was a contract compliance worker for the state of New York drug abuse programs. And so I said, "Well, okay." I had been to New Mexico and always wanted to come back. I'd driven that road from Taos to Angel Fire and was, just connected to that somehow. And so I said, "Okay, I want to spend a week in New Mexico because I'd like to live in Taos, if possible. And then a week in Southern California, where the lady who was responsible for me and Marty meeting was in a graduate school of psychology." So we spent a week in New Mexico. I had 2 job offers. And then we went to California and spent the other week with our friend Ray.
So did you take one of the job offers?
I did.
And what was your first job in New Mexico?
I was working with the district attorney's office. Ira Robinson was the district attorney at the time. I started in juvenile court. C.A. Barman was my supervisor. Bill Reardon was the judge. And after about 5 or 6 months, because I actually couldn't get admitted, it took about 3 months after I arrived here. I think that was the deal. So I was in juvenile division for 4 or 5 months maybe. And then I went up to felonies. And that's where I met Dan Schneider, who was one of my mentors.
So did you have some jury trials then as a prosecutor?
In the juvenile court, there were bench trials and then there were jury trials, and I had a number of those back then. And felonies, they were less frequent because they were more difficult cases. But the last case I had was a murder case. Dan Schneider and I worked that case together. And I had had enough by that time. I really didn't enjoy 2 things. I really didn't enjoy putting people in prison, even though I suspected or knew that some of them really belonged there. I just didn't like that process. And the other thing that bothered me is that many of the criminal defense attorneys, and I'm not going to name any names, they just didn't do a very good job. And I oftentimes, knowing what was right and what had to be done, wound up doing some of their work for them. And those two things combined, I didn't want to do it anymore.
So what did you do?
I rented a space in Ernesto Romero's office. A good friend of mine at that time was a fellow by the name of Jeff Libet. And some of the old timers may remember Jeff. He was a lawyer, and he was a good lawyer, a smart guy. And he and Ernie were friends. And Jeff went to Ernie and said, "Hey, Terry needs a place to begin practice. You got a room, would you rent it to him?" And he said, "Yeah." So I started at Ernie's office. And after about 3 months, maybe a little bit less, Ernie came in and said, "Look, do you want to be my partner?" And I looked at him, I said, "You gotta be crazy. I got 15 cases, you got 80, and you want me to be an equal partner? You're nuts." And he said, "Look, we've got a lot of work here." Ernie was represented Billy Marchiondo in the Levitt libel case at that point. And I said, "Well, if you're willing to do it, I'll do it." And so I don't know whether we ever had a written agreement or not, or it was on a handshake, I don't recall. But a couple of days later, Ernie comes in and he says, "I need help on the Marchiondo case, and I want to hire Michael V. Hill." And I said, "Who's Michael V. Hill?" He says, "He's a guy, he's kind of fresh out of law school, but he's really smart." And I said, and he said, "We got a bunch of depositions and motions coming up, and I need somebody to help me take care of that, and you'll take care of the rest of the practice." So I said, "All right." And the Michael V. Hill that he's talking about is now our Chief Justice at the New Mexico Supreme Court. So that's one of the things that I kind of like to think about is, I hired Michael. And he was a good lawyer. He was a good lawyer even way back then. And part of my job is in the libel cases, I handled some lower level types of depositions when those guys were busy doing other things. And they sent me down to Billy Marchiondo's office to get paid. And let me tell you, that was not an easy part of my responsibilities. But Billy and I became friends over that. And then he considered that he was a mentor of mine, and always reminded me of that whenever I saw him.
As you collected what was up.
And he was really smart. What he would do is, let's say the bill was $5,000. He'd give me 4 to keep us hanging and to keep us working on it. Interesting times.
Did you have a kind of a general practice at that time, or did you have some areas that you emphasized?
At that time, the law firm, aside from the Marchiondo case, was a general practice law firm. So we did everything. The training that I had in the Buffalo firm, I thought was very beneficial. It turns out it was very beneficial, particularly in the real estate cases. Right? And so I worked with Ernie for about a year and a half. And the situation just wasn't right for me.
So what happened next?
Trying to remember what I did. I know I opened up my own practice.
Well, let's just go from there.
Right now I can't remember where I opened it, frankly. But I started my practice, and the way it evolved is I wound up doing a fair amount of personal injury work and a fair amount of real estate work. Our office, I was with Brent Ricks at that point in time. We weren't partners, but we shared office space. And we were in a building with a title company upstairs. So we got a lot of work, or I got a lot of work from the title company at that point in time. So I developed a practice that was roughly half real estate and half personal injury, and a little bit of, I'd write some wills and some AB trusts and very low-level criminal stuff. But it was mostly real estate and personal injury.
It probably helps when you're starting out on your own, right, to have some business coming in from the title company.
It helped. It definitely helped.
So are there some interesting cases that you'd like to share with the oral history here? I'm sure you have many.
How long do we have? Let me narrow it down a little bit.
Please do.
There were two cases that established law here in New Mexico. The first case was the lawsuit Consortium case.
Tell us about that.
I had a widow come in to see me, and her husband had been killed in a T-bone accident out by where the jail is now on I-40. He pulled out, and somebody didn't see him smack at the driver's door and killed him. And when I was listening to Mrs. Romero, she was talking about her husband, because I needed to know about him as well as her. And I'm listening, and I'm saying, God, this guy was an incredible husband. This guy was a husband that most women would die for. I mean, he did everything for her and with her. And so I said, well, we've got a lawsuit Consortium case here. Well, then I went to the law, and according to a 1986 Supreme Court cases, New Mexico didn't recognize lawsuit Consortium as a cause of action. So I pled it anyway, figured that I'd get booted out of the district court, and we would appeal it. And that's what happened. The district court judge was Thibaut Chavez. And Thibaut was a really interesting guy. If he liked you, he was good to you. And if he didn't, he was not. And he kind of liked me for whatever reason. Here's this Anglo guy down in Los Lunas as an attorney trying to help this Anglo lady, or this Hispanic lady. And his decision from the bench is, Mr. Revo, I agree with you. And I feel badly having to deny or grant the motion to dismiss. But I think that you've got a really good case here, and I think that you should take it up to our Supreme Court. And I said, okay, Judge, I'll do that. I knew I was going to have to do it. And I did, and we won. And so that was somewhere around 1994. Romero v. Byers was the name of that case. And the other case is I was a plaintiff, which is an unusual position for a plaintiff's attorney to be in, that you're now the plaintiff. And it was a hot and heavy case. There was a decision out of the U.S. Supreme Court in Shapiro versus Kentucky that allowed attorneys to send solicitation letters to people. Now, Shapiro was a real estate attorney, and what he was trying to do is help people that had been served with foreclosure papers to avoid the foreclosure and work out some sort of deal. And I was working with a practice coach at that time, and he brought me the article on Shapiro versus Kentucky, and he said, Terry, I think you ought to do this. And I said, we're not supposed to do that. I knew the Bates case, from 1977, and I knew how it impacted Joe Fine, for example, and there was some real negativity back at that time. Joe would tell me that his friends, his lawyer friends, several of them would not talk to him because he started advertising. And it was a very difficult time for him. And of course, I went to law school during the period of time that attorneys were not supposed to advertise. You were supposed to join boards, hand out cards at social events and stuff like that. So I said to my coach, I said, I'm not sure I can do that. He said, well, I don't see why you can't. The Supreme Court said you could do it. And I said, well, let me think about it. I talked to my wife. Marty and I got married. I'll go back a little bit. Thanksgiving Eve in 1977. And we left Buffalo that Sunday night, next Sunday night, in a snowstorm.
To come to New Mexico.
It's to come to New Mexico. That was our honeymoon, traveling across country in the gray and the rain. And so, we talked about it, and she said, Terry, you can do it as long as you do it right. So I sat down and I composed a letter that ran by her, and we both agreed that this didn't put any pressure on anybody. It acknowledged where we got the information from. We acknowledged that a lot of people did not have an attorney that they either knew or wanted to go to, and that this was my practice of law. At that time, I had gone completely personal injury, 1988, I believe. This is what I do, and I'm happy to help you if you're interested. And then the last paragraph was that if you already have an attorney, I wish you the best and good luck. And you can disregard this letter and throw it in the trash, something like that. And so I said, all right, I'm going to try this. And so the first group of letters was like about 12 or 15. And I took them to the mailbox. And honestly, I had fear in my heart as I dropped those letters in the mailbox. And, I went home and I talked with my wife about that. And I said, I'm really worried about this. And she said, it'll be all right. And she was right. What happened is that people were responding to those letters because they felt like they needed help. They didn't know how or where to find it. And if they knew an attorney, it was an attorney that didn't practice in that area, or someone who they knew as a kid and didn't trust them. I mean, that's what people were telling me when they came in.
Where were you getting the information to?
From the police reports. I would send one of my assistants down to the police records room, and they had the police reports. Back then, you could get them in a day or two, as opposed to 2 weeks. And they would look through them, and they, would see, would read the who's at fault kind of thing, and the narrative as to what happened. And if it looked like it could be a plaintiff's attorney, and it looked like it was the type of accident where somebody could be injured, they brought that information back. We put it into letter form, and we sent them out. And very frankly, I built a hell of a practice doing that. And what I came to understand was that there was a number of people, good people, that were not being served by the plaintiff's bar. And if you had a death case, and if you had real serious injuries, everybody was interested. But the small, low-impact rear enders where you have neck and back and headache kind of things, these people were not being serviced. And so I switched fairly quickly from being afraid of what might happen to me to like say, hey, this is really good. I like these people. A lot of them came in hat in hand. They'd never talked to an attorney before. They didn't know what to do. the only attorneys they knew about were the attorneys in the movies or on television. And they were really nice, they were kind people. And I said, yeah, I can help these folks, and I did. And I built an incredible practice. At times, there were 12 to 15 new inquiries a month.
Wow. So how did that result in you becoming a plaintiff in a lawsuit?
I'll try to shorten this. In the early 1990s, maybe 1990, maybe 1991 in there, two things were happening in the personal injury business. Allstate primarily, but other insurance companies were starting to do a lot of dishonest advertising in magazines.
The so-called tort reform?
Yeah. And people were reading that. And, they were being really turned off in many ways. So that was one part of it. The other part of it is that some of the top plaintiffs' attorneys were having a difficult time in the courtroom. They were losing cases. They were getting lower numbers than what they thought was fair. And instead of looking to the insurance companies and fighting them, they figured, well, it's these guys that are sending out the letters. That's our problem. They're creating negativity in our community. And it reminds me of a movie we all know about, River City. So these were the trial lawyers at that time, plaintiffs' trial lawyers. And they set up a meeting and invited me, Ron Bell, Joe Fine, and Hinkle. I don't know if anybody else was there. And they told us that this letter thing, of course Bell was doing billboards at that time also. This letter thing has got to stop because it's hurting us. And I'm not going to go into detail about what happened at the meeting, but it was weird. All right, so after they exhorted us, I think is the right word, to stop doing this, they gave us an opportunity to speak. And, I got up. I'm pretty scared, to tell you the truth, because these were the big guys. And I said, look, the Supreme Court says that I can do this. There's nothing in my letter that coerces people or in any way pressures them to call me. And I can tell you that I've developed a very nice practice. And the people that were coming in response to my letter, you guys, you were not servicing them. And I said, and if you do anything to try and stop me, I'll take you across the street. Now, what that meant at the time, we were meeting in that bank building, and there was the old courthouse across the street from that.
Right, the Rio Grande Bank?
Yeah, whatever that was. They used their meeting room for that. And I said, I'll take you across the street. And I said, and that's not a threat, it's a promise. And then what happened is some of them got together with some of their friends up in the Supreme Court. I won't name any names. And they got them to pass a disciplinary rule that said that you cannot solicit by phone or mail any personal injury or wrongful death case. And if you do, you could lose your license. So I said, well, and I went up to the Supreme Court before that came down. And I tried to talk to the 5 members. And there were 3 of them that talked to me and 2 of them that wouldn't. And, So, you know, I realized at that point in time they were going to pass the disciplinary rule. And, you know, the strange thing about it is I could solicit a divorce, I could solicit the probate for the guy that got killed in the accident. You know, I could solicit business stuff. I could solicit foreclosures. But I couldn't solicit personal injury cases or wrongful death cases. So I hired Chuck Pfeiffer as my attorney. And it was Browning and Pfeiffer at that time. And Jim Browning, now a federal district court judge, did some work on my case, but it was mostly Chuck and one of their associates, a fellow by the name of Raul Carrillo, who has now got a very decent practice down in Las Cruces. And the two of them fought the defense team. And they did an incredible job. It was pretty intense. These are guys that were friendly, you know, pat you on the back, you know, we need a little money for this, we need a little money for that, and we know that you're willing to help us out. It was nasty. It was really nasty. And Chuck and Raul did a phenomenal job there were 4 attorneys on the other side. And it was in front of Judge Burciaga.
In federal court?
In federal court. We made a motion for a TRO. And Chuck, of course, argued it for me. And Tulsa was the attorney for the Attorney General. And he did a good job in terms of trying to argue and, you know, work around some of the issues. And I thought Chuck did a really good job. All we were asking is that, look, you can give us a quick trial. We're ready to do that. But give us a TRO so that Mr. Revo could continue practicing. And he denied the TRO on grounds that neither Tulsa or Chuck argued. And interestingly enough, Marty was, my wife Marty was in the audience, and she was sitting next to Ginny Ferrara, who was disciplinary counsel at that time. And I knew Ginny from the district attorney's office. Mm-hmm. And we were good acquaintances. I wouldn't say that we were friends. She turned to Marty and said, you know, if Terry would agree to a 15-day delay, I'd be good with that. And Marty told me about that, and I talked with Chuck, and he put that proposal out to Ginny. And the other side said no.
So what was the other side? Besides, you were the plaintiff, and then you said the Attorney General is representing the other side. How did that come about?
Well, some of the some of the top professional personal injury attorneys. I'm not sure how this happened because I was not part of it at all. But 4 attorneys, and this is a record, so I can talk about it. Steve Durkovich was the lead attorney. Damon Eli, who worked for Carpenter at that time, Bill Carpenter. Bruce Hall and Andy Schultz were the 4 guys against me.
The Rohde firm?
Rohde firm. And Durkovich and Eli were the ones that were really honcho in the case. And it was really nasty. There's a number of stories that I can talk to you about, but I'm not going to because, you know, it doesn't add to what we're trying to do.
How did the Attorney General get involved?
They kicked him out. They basically said, we're going to do this and we're going to do this without fee, but we want you, the Attorney General, to withdraw. So the Attorney General, I guess, made a decision that Tulsa could withdraw. And so it was those 4 guys against Chuck and Raul. They gave us an extended, or not an extended, a very quick trial. The rule was put into effect July 31st, 1991. And so I forgot where I was going, I'm sorry.
Well, so what was the effect on your practice of having this rule go into effect? It was a disciplinary rule?
Yeah, it was a disciplinary rule. I know where I was going. So Berciaga gave us a very quick setting for December of that year. And it was a lot of depositions, a lot of back and forth, a lot of motions and stuff like that. And we had a 1-week trial in December. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I really didn't know what was going to happen. I knew that the judge was against us. So we had the trial. And he said, well, I'll take this under advisement. You can expect a decision reasonably soon. This was December 1991. Chuck would go over, or maybe Browning also, would go over to Berciaga on other cases. And they'd say, hey, Judge, what's happening with that Revo case? And he said, well, it's right there on my table. And he said, I'm going to get to it. And all that kind of stuff. Well, when he died, it was discovered on the end of his table, and he hadn't done anything. No findings of fact, no conclusions of law, nothing. And so he didn't grant the TRO, and another one, he gave the other side the ability to curtail my practice with no decision.
Mm-hmm.
So when Judge Berciaga died, Judge Conway took it over. And we went to a meeting of all the attorneys, Marty and I, and we sat way back in the room. And my impression was that he was not going to be favorable to our arguments. In other words, I'll tell you what I said. I turned to Marty, I said, we are screwed. But what Conway decided to do is that he would read the trial record, and then after he read the trial record, he'd reconvene. And he did. And he said to Steve Durkovich, he said, Steve, he said, I think this Florida case, which is the 15-day delay, I think that settles everything, doesn't it? And Steve turned white as a sheet from my perspective. And almost stammered a bit. And that was unlike Steve, because he was a hell of a good attorney. And he said, well, Judge, we want to brief that. And he said, well, Steve, you can brief it if you like. But he said, what I think you guys ought to do is you ought to get together and settle this. And he said, I think a mediation might be in order here. And I turned to Chuck and I said, yeah. So we agreed to that. And then Judge Conway said to Steve, he said, why don't you get one of your guys or yourself, go up and talk to the Supremes and see if they're willing to go to a mediation and see if this dispute with Mr. Revo can be resolved. And I think Damon went up there, and they said no. And so he got us together again, and Damon told the judge, no, they're not willing to do a mediation with Mr. Revo. He said, well, all right. He said, well, I've got some work to do. And he said, I still think that 15-day rule, if both sides would agree, would be helpful. And they wouldn't, because what they wanted a detailed record to take to the United States Supreme Court. Because all the other cases, the advertising cases, did not have a complete record. They just had a denial. And so that's what they were looking to do. And so I was sitting there quiet because I wasn't the lawyer. And I was saying, you know, you guys made a mistake. I think you're pissing the judge off. And so he went, and we submitted our findings and conclusions. The other side submitted theirs. And in my opinion, you could ask Chuck, because I don't know if he shares this opinion, is that Judge Conway's findings and conclusions were better than the ones we submitted. And so I could do it. And it was basically filed as a civil rights case, so the state paid me a bunch of money, which I shared with Chuck. But one of the chiropractors in the community who were, and their board adopted that same restriction, filed a state court action. And that was still pending. So in state court, there was still an issue of not being able to do that. So it was February of 1996. That Sylvan Siegel, of blessed memory, said, hey, you won. And it was on a Saturday morning. It was the Saturday morning of my daughter's Bar Mitzvah. So you can imagine there was a lot of stuff going on. I didn't bother reading the paper. And Sylvan said, he said, you won. And I said, what did I win? And he said, the state court dismissed that chiropractor's case. So you're free to go ahead and do what you want. I said, really? Yeah. So I did. That Tuesday, I started sending letters out, and 4 months later, I stopped the practice. Now, you probably want to know why.
I would like to know why. Tell us, Terry.
In the time period from when the disciplinary rule was implemented to the time of Conway's ruling, the other attorneys who weren't doing letters, who were doing billboards and television advertising, they kind of switched the mentality of the community about what to do when you needed a lawyer. And so all these guys did incredibly well during that period of time where I couldn't send those letters out. And, you know, I'd run into some of them and they'd say, Terry, thank you. Because their practice expanded during that period of time. But what happened is that I was used to getting really good cases, really good people that I thought I could work with and would work with my firm. We had 10 people at the firm as of July 1991, including me. And it was easier back then. It was easier back then to resolve cases. The people that I was getting from my letters, I didn't like the quality of the case or the people that were coming in. And many of them had gone to other attorneys first and been declined by those attorneys. And, you know, it wasn't right anymore. And so I stopped doing it in June of 1996.
So how did your practice evolve after that?
Well, I mean, we were down to 2 paralegals and me at that point in time. And I gradually built my practice back up. I stayed in personal injury almost exclusively. And that was then, and, you know, this is now.
Well, and you've made it from then till now with a smile on your face. So
I think I've survived.
I think you have. Wow, that's quite a story.
It was quite an experience living it, let me tell you.
It has has a certain David and Goliath quality to it.
You know, I never thought of myself as David, but okay,
You'll take it, huh?
I'll take it.
Let's see. Let's pivot now. What are some of your primary interests or involvements outside the law?
Well, right now, you know, being retired for 9 months or so, I'm really just kind of relaxing and catching my breath and understanding the seriousness of the weight of the practice of law and the stress that is involved. It's kind of like you don't know it until you don't do it anymore. Visually, what it appeared to me is that the yoke of the practice of law just kind of lifted off my shoulders. And
How did that feel?
it felt great. And, you know, I miss the action. I really do. But I made a decision that I wasn't going to practice law anymore. And that goes to issues of being involved in not-for-profit corporations, excuse me, and sitting on boards and, you know, doing volunteer work pro bono. Because my feeling was, right or wrong, that if I was going to practice law, I wouldn't have retired. You know, what I recognized in the practice of law is you give an awful lot of yourself to your clients and to everybody around, including defense attorneys, judges. And I just didn't realize how much was there in terms of pressure until I said no more. And I intend to do that. Now, what am I going to do now? I'm not sure. I spend my time, I moved my office at home. I'm now at home. And that brings up a whole new set of problems. Is that, I was talking before, that it gives a whole new meaning to cohabitation. You know, the house was Marty's. And, you know, I'd leave at 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, whatever time it was. I'd come back at 5, 6, 6:30. I'd work on weekends, I'd work on nights and nights and stuff like that. So I was really out of her hair most of the time. And then here I am around the house 24/7. So we had some discussions. And I think we worked it out fairly well. And I know that everybody who brings their practice at home, particularly during the pandemic, when people were working out of their homes, you know, they had to deal with those types of problems.
Can you tell us a little bit about community service activities that you've been involved in through the years?
I'm just trying to go back to what I think the beginning might be. And I'm not sure I did much in the way of community service in Buffalo. But out here I worked with New Day Runaway. I was on their board for 3-4 years. I was asked to be on the board of the Jewish Federation. And I said, well, okay. You know, I'll do this, because I knew it was a very difficult time in the Jewish community because we were trying to raise the Jewish Community Center out of the ground. And then there was the Federation that serviced other agencies as well as the Jewish Community Center. And I knew there was going to be a lot of conflict going on during that period of time. So I said, well, okay. You want me to be on the Federation board, and I'll agree to do that under one condition. And they said, what's that? And I said, I won't practice law. I said, I'll be on your board. I'll give you everything I possibly can, including some money. But I don't want to be the lawyer for the board. And they said, fine, agreed. Well, that lasted about a half hour. Because I think that was kind of foolish on my part. Because a dispute arose, and everybody said, well, Terry, what do you think? And I said, okay, I'll write a letter. And that was the beginning. And it was somewhat of a difficult fight over the years. Because this is not a wealthy community in any respects. The broader community, the Jewish community, they're not wealthy communities like you see in other principal cities around the country. And so I was never the chair, but I was on the executive committee from day one, and for about 5 years. And those were fairly tumultuous 5 years, particularly being between the Federation and the Jewish Community Center. And then when the Jewish Community Center opened, I didn't think it was right for me to be on their board because of some of the disagreements. But I said, I'll take responsibility for some committees. And so I chaired 2 of the committees in the beginning, and I realized that wasn't working well either. So I withdrew from that, and I stayed on the JCC board for, I guess, another 4 or 5 years.
You've been involved with the Senior Lawyers Division for quite some time. What are some of the activities that you've been involved with the division?
Well, this is one of them.
Well,
I think I started in 2006, 2007. The oral histories, like we're doing now, were already in process. And, people like Jonathan Sutton was on the board, Dan Bayless, who, as a shout out to Dan, I thought he's been the backbone of the Senior Lawyers Division.
and he's still on the board.
And he's still on the board. Bob Scott, Judge Scott was on the board at that time. And I know I'm missing somebody, and I can't think of who it was. But after a year or so, it became time to find a new chair, and nobody wanted it. So I said, well, I'll do it. I don't think there's ever a contested election for the chair of the Senior Lawyers Division. So I started it, and I was a fairly directive chair. What I recognized from the other boards that I sat on is that if you let it go, if you let people just keep on talking and not deciding, your meeting's going to go on forever and nobody's going to be happy. So I took a more aggressive approach. And, after we talked about something for maybe, 10 minutes or so, I'd say, well, okay, everybody knows what the different sides are. Let's take a vote. And that way things got done. We looked at trying to bring in more members, because the way it worked at that time, and it's pretty much the same thing now, is if you were 55 years or older and practiced law for 25 years or more, you were automatically a member. So a lot of the people, there was 2,000 people on that board, or in the division.
Members of the division, not necessarily on the board. Division.
And most people didn't even know. A lot of people weren't clamoring to join the Senior Lawyers Division because they didn't want to really admit that they were a senior lawyer. So we did the oral history and expanded that considerably during that time. And I did a bunch of them. I was sitting in your chair, and I loved it.
Do you recall some of the people you interviewed?
Oh, yeah. Judge Joseph Baca, Dan Schneider, Ginny Ferrara. I forgot his name. I'd see his face. Judge Franchini. Those are the names that come to mind right now. I know that there were more. I hope nobody feels offended if I left someone out.
In preparing for this, you told a story about appearing before Judge Franchini defending a motion for a prisoner's release. Could you share that story?
Yeah, I can. It was after I moved up to felonies at the district attorney's office. And a little bit of history. You know, when I came here, I hardly knew anybody. You know, I met some people, mostly criminal defense lawyers, during the time when I was in juvenile court. Obviously, Judge Reardon, C.A. Bowerman, and a number of other people. But when I went up to felonies, it was within the first couple of weeks. And Marty Diamond was in trial on a case. And he said, look, I got this hearing. It shouldn't be very difficult. Can you step in and handle it for me? And I said, sure. What's the issue? He said, well, the defendant is Italian. He's been in jail, kept in jail, waiting his trial for about 2-3 months now. And Franchini's the judge. And the defense attorney, and I don't remember who his defense attorney is, made a motion to release this guy from Friday morning till Monday morning. And then he'd go back to jail because his family from back east was coming out to celebrate St. Joseph's Day. And, I thought what St. Joseph's Day was a feast of some sort. So anyway, we're in the courtroom. It's Monday afternoon. Gene's up on the bench. And the courtroom is just full of attorneys because it's motion hearing, criminal motion hearing. And so, wouldn't you know it, my case was the first one called. So I go up there, and the defense attorney makes his spiel. And I argued to keep the guy in jail. And I could tell, I was looking at Gene's face, and I said, I know I'm going to lose this motion. And I didn't really care one way or the other, but I gave it a good try. Mm-hmm. And so Gene would do this. He'd listen, and when he's ready to decide, he'd move his glasses down. And he leans over the bench, and I go, oh, here it comes. And he says, Mr. Revo, you being Italian must understand how important St. Joseph's Day is, and that how embarrassed this defendant would be with his whole family coming out. So, you being Italian, you must be able to understand this. And I looked up at him, and I said, Judge Franchini, I said, I'm not Italian, I'm Jewish. And he goes, then you lose the motion. Cut him loose. And that's one of the many, many, many Franchini stories that we all know and like to talk about and laugh about. He was truly an incredible character. And he was, I knew him. He was one of the first judges that I got to know when I came to town. Here's this Anglo guy from back east. He's now in the district attorney's office and all this kind of stuff. And so I would go to him when I didn't understand what was happening. And Gene would give me the background. And I go, oh, so that's what happened. And the whole courtroom just laughed, this uproarious laughter that he was capable of generating. So that's one of the district attorney cases that I remember very well.
Well, let's shift to a few reflections. Can you talk a little bit about what was the courthouse like at that time when you first came to New Mexico?
Well, I think there's a larger question there. And it wasn't just the courthouse. It was the community. The community was much tighter in many ways because you knew most of the people. The courthouse was an awful lot looser. If you needed to get something signed, you'd show up at 8:10 or 8:15 in the morning and say, look, I got an order here, I need the judge to sign. And, the secretaries, who were just, many of them real characters, would take it in, or say, go in and talk to the judge, and you sign off an order to get it filed. There was always coffee to be had, and there was a lot of just talk and a lot of community back then. And the practice of law, broader. The practice of law was very different back then. You knew you were going to see your opposing counsel again. It was not like the bigger cities where you have a case with a lawyer and then you never see that lawyer again. And it was friendly. And I'll tell you another story that Gene told me that is indicative of what this community was like. He got out of law school and got his license, passed the bar, got his license, and 2 weeks later, whoever he was working for, and I don't remember who it was, said, Gene, there's this trial coming up. It's a jury trial. It starts on Monday, and you're going to represent the plaintiff. And he goes, what? He said, I don't know how to do that. I never did one of those before. And they said, you'll be fine. And so, he goes in there and he just does his best. And he said one of the things that really impressed him is that whenever there was a break, the attorneys on the other side, knowing that this was his first trial, would come over and talk to him about, Gene, you did it this way, why don't you try doing it that way the next time? So it was like they knew that they were going to be in contact with him over the years. And they wanted him to be a good attorney. And they weren't going to disclose anything very private, but they wanted to help. They wanted to help make him a better attorney because it made our community a better legal community. And that's what the courthouse was like. And that's what people were like. I mean, there were parties in December. Marty and I would scratch our head and say, how can we go to all these parties? But starting December 1, there was at least 1 or 2 parties given by one of the law offices every night. And that was part of the community back then. And we made good friends through the judicial and the legal community contacts. I liked the community back then. And the community now, it's much tougher. It's much tougher to do business. It's much tougher to practice law. The judges are much more aware of not demonstrating partiality. It's just harder to practice. And another thing that I wanted to bring up is that in the last 5-10 years, what I've noticed is that the younger attorneys were really not getting much in the way of mentoring. The way it used to be is, the attorneys at the top of the class would go to the larger firms, and they would always get mentoring at those firms, and developed close relationships with some of the senior partners. And then the other groups would go, it's not group. The other attorneys, new attorneys, would try and find a place with some local attorney that was maybe a 1, 2, 3, 4 attorney office, and then would get mentored there. What I'm seeing with a lot of the younger attorneys now, they're really not getting mentored. you graduate law school, you don't know how to practice law. And you don't know how to be a businessman. You don't know really how to be a professional. And it's the guidance that used to happen that doesn't seem to be happening anymore, particularly with some of the larger firms. They're just giving a case to somebody and saying, bill the hell out of this case. That's my opinion. It may not be true all over, but that's my opinion. I've seen that happen time and time again. And a lot of times, just like when I told you in the district attorney's office, I would try and help the attorney on the other side. Now, I wouldn't give away my case, but you know, I remember one attorney in particular. I was talking to him, and his father and his brother were plaintiff's attorneys, and he was working for a defense firm. We were going up to take depositions of my clients up in Montana or Wyoming someplace, and you know, I got to know him a little bit, and he did the depositions. And afterwards, I said to him, I said, let's go get a beer. So he said, okay. And I said, I'm going to tell you some things, and I hope that you take it as a gesture of friendship, and a gesture as a gesture just of knowing you're going to be in the profession for a while, and that you know, there's certain things about the profession that would be very helpful to a new attorney. So I went through some of the ways he conducted the depositions, and I said, you know, your question was too long here. You didn't pick up on the plaintiff's answer here. You know, those kinds of things. And I said, you don't have to do this, but my suggestion is that when you get the deposition transcript, you go back and then just read your questions. So you see in your own mind how you could have answered that question or asked that question in a shorter, simpler way. And then if you do that, go back and read the answers. And then I think what you'll see is you're shorter the question, the longer the answer. And that guy's now doing plaintiff's work. And, you know, and I see him once in a while, I have lunch with him. And, you know, I like doing that. I like, if the other side is being reasonable, I don't mind helping them out. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I don't know if other attorneys do this, but I didn't start out to do this. It just kind of dawned on me that this is what I was doing, is I try to develop two channels of communication with opposing counsel. One was personal, and the other was legal. And I found that I was capable, for whatever reason, to be able to float between one and the other. And I've always thought that, take a personal injury case. You got a plaintiff's attorney, you got a defense attorney. Their jobs, their goals are really not all that different.
What is that goal?
Well, the goal is to get the case resolved. Now, you're probably going to go about doing it in different ways. But, you know, I want to get my client's case resolved. The pressure that the defense attorney is getting is save us some money. You know, try if you can get this resolved without having to go to trial. And so I thought that our jobs were somewhat similar. So I would try and develop an interpersonal relationship with the people on the other side, be they adjusters or be they attorneys. And I found, given who I was, my personality, the way I went about being a lawyer, that worked well for me most of the time. And when it didn't, I tried to take the lesson and move forward.
Are there any other aspects of your career or thoughts you'd like to share for?
I know you're going to ask me that question. I would always tell my clients that when they get asked that question in a deposition, is there anything else you want me to know? To give me an opportunity to object, and I would. But this is a different story. We're in a different context here today. I'm glad that I moved to New Mexico. And, you know, at times it wasn't always easy. I think the thing that I feel the worst about is that my two kids, and you haven't asked me about my family yet, didn't grow up near their grandparents. Now, they had the benefit of growing up in a different culture than if we would have stayed in Buffalo. And so one of the things that we always wanted for our children, they knew they were going to college, there was no question about that, is that we wanted them to go to college out of state. And they did. And so Marty and I have two children. We were older parents. I was 39, Marty was 35 at that point. It had been nice to have grandparents around. And I also felt bad for my parents, that they didn't have the opportunity to have their grandchildren near them, you know, a mile or two away or a town away or whatever. That took something away from their lives also. But it's not a but, it's an and. Marty and I think, have done well here. We have mostly been accepted by the community. And that was a big question I had, you know. How is this community that's at least half Hispanic and the other half mostly rural farmers and ranchers, how is that community going to accept us? You know, a couple of Jewish kids from back east who didn't go to school here. And what I found is that the community, for the most part, was very accepting. I don't think that we had trouble making friends. But a lot of the friends that we made already had their group of friends. So we kind of got attached to that, or didn't, you know. It was kind of interesting the way that happened. So our two kids, Shauna, who is 39, and Ian, who is 33. Shauna is a shareholder in an architectural design firm that designs the interiors of new senior residences. And our son Ian, you know, for a while, you know, he worked in bars and he was a waiter and worked in a ski shop and a bike shop, and finally decided that he wanted to be a nurse practitioner. And so he found a program up in Denver, and it was an accelerated program. It was 1 year, and he got his bachelor's of RN. And what he realized that he liked is he liked the action of medicine. He applied for and got a job in the complex medical ICU in Denver General or Denver Home, whatever they call it these days. And so he's right now, we're in April, he's maybe just shy of 2 months in the job, and he loves it, just loves it. He goes, there is so much to learn, there's so much that we, as people who don't know about these ICUs, so much that goes on. So I'm very pleased that both of our kids not only found places where they can, you know, live and grow and enjoy themselves and progress in their stated professions, but Marty and I are also very, very lucky that our kids love each other. And they're so much fun to be with, and they like hanging out with us. You know, I know parents where, you know, the interaction between them and their children is strained or somehow awful. We know people that are in litigation with their children. I mean, it's horrible, horrible, horrible. But we are blessed, truly, that our children are the way they are.
Well, and I suspect you and your wife have a significant influence on how that turned out.
Yeah.
It's what you hope for, but what you can't count on, right?
Well, you know, the kids who like and love you are very willing to talk to you about what they decide are your faults. And, you know, I always wonder what people who don't have children, for whatever the reason, they don't have that feedback from their children who, you know, who think that they're not cool, or that's a stupid outfit you got on, or no, I don't want to go there because you're being unfair, you know, that kind of stuff. And we're very lucky that we have kids that truly care for us and that work well with us and keep our fingers crossed that they'll take good care of us when that is needed. In terms of anything else I wanted to talk about, I'll think of it after we're off the record. I know that we're going to do that. But let me ask you, Peter, is there, you know, you've seen me, we've known each other for 2-3 years now, your time. And by the way, Peter was chair of the Senior Lawyers Division, and then decided to take on this responsibility. Anything else that you want to ask me? Or Charlene, do you have any questions?
No.
I think I've gone through the questions I have. It sounds like you may not have grandchildren yet, but if they come, they're going to be lucky to have a grandfather like yourself. And so I'd like to wrap this up by just thanking you for taking the time to be with us. And it certainly seems to me that you've had a successful career and a successful family life, and having both of those, neither one is assured. And the fact that it's turned out as it has, I think, is a very positive thing for yourself, your family, and our community. And I want to thank you for all you've done, and thank you for being willing to join the archives of the oral histories of the Senior Lawyers Division.
Well, a couple of things before we sign off.
Sure.
Let me see your question sheet, because it may jog my memory as to something that I wanted to say that I forgot to say. I won't tell anybody about your notes. Oh yeah, one of the things. I told you about the Prisoners Legal Assistance Project that I worked in for 2 years. Before I got that job, my goal when I became a lawyer was to be a criminal defense lawyer. And after I interviewed about 1,000 guys in that 2 years at Attica, I said, I'm not going to put my life's blood and my life's energy into keeping these guys on the streets. Because most of those people that I represented, in my opinion, deserve to be there. Notwithstanding their protestations of innocence. And they would always freely admit, yeah, I did a lot of the things, but I didn't do what they put me away for. So that changed my perspective. I came out of there saying, I am not going to be a criminal defense lawyer. And then I looked at what little I had done and said, I like the plaintiff's work. And so that was the beginning that was a major switch in my career. And I'm glad, really glad that I took that. Well, I wanted to talk about clinical programs. I was fortunate enough to go to a law school that was very advanced for their time about the clinical programs. And the woman that hired me, she was the head of the prison project, but she also had other responsibilities. And the desk that I had was right in front of her office. So whenever she got a call from the city court, hey, we need one of your students to come over and represent this guy, she'd go, Terry. So during that clinical program, most of the students had, maybe 3 or 4 experiences. I had 20, 25 because she keeps sending me over there. And so when I actually got out of law school, I had a better idea of what you needed to do to practice law than most people. So I think the clinical programs at the law school, and I know that there's a lot of them here now, are very, very important. And I hope that that continues. I was also thinking, if I could make a recommendation to the law school, that they have at least one course, and maybe 2, in the business of law, as opposed to just the profession of law. Because it's a business, it's a profession. It's a business, it's a profession. And anybody who's had to make a payroll knows there's a strong business aspect to the profession. And you need to keep both of those in mind as you practice a lawyer. And I think it would be beneficial if the law school could do a little bit more in that area.
Speaking of the law school, you have been involved with the Senior Lawyers Division Memorial Scholarship Program, and in that regard, haven't you? Tell us about your interactions with the law school and what this program is.
We both forgot about that while we were talking, and here we are, members of the board. This was not a new program when I signed on to the board. And it's the Senior Lawyers Scholarship event that honors the lawyers that have died in the previous year. And what we do is we give away scholarships to third-year law students. And we have them write an essay on a topic, 500 words. And then we have a committee that reads all of these submissions and then gets together and votes on who's going to get the 2, 3, or not even 4 scholarships. And it's been very, very interesting to see how these third-year law students function or don't function. I took my responsibilities very seriously, and I know you did often, always. Also, that's the right word. That's what happens when you get a little older.
One of those A words.
I know it begins with an A. And I took my responsibilities very seriously because what you're doing is you're honoring these lawyers that spent their careers and oftentimes put their heart and their souls into the practice, representing their clients. We wanted to be able to acknowledge that. And so we're in our 6th or 7th year now. And this past year, Peter, we had to go to Phoenix for something that my wife needed, so I couldn't be there. And you were my stand-in, and you did an incredible job. So I'm going to ask you to do it again this year. And so I'm very proud of the work that I did and that we did in the Senior Lawyers Division. And my only hope was that more people would get involved and we'd be able to broaden our scope of participation. What we used to do on, I think it was Channel 4, we used to have once a month, there'd be 4 or 5 of the lawyers from the board that would go down there and people would call in with questions. You know, it's kind of like similar to what we do now with the Lollapalooza or Lawyer Day or whatever they call the programs. That was always a lot of fun. And then we go out and have a drink or so afterwards. But the time that I spent with the senior lawyers, I'm really appreciative of that opportunity to commit in that context. Let's see what else.
Well, one more thing that you mentioned that I think is worth bringing out is that in the course of your career, you filed many, you had to file many litigations, right? And then how did that turn out in terms of jury trials or and jury verdicts?
I can tell you, and I'll be honest, I'm not the greatest trial attorney. But I really appreciate my ability to work with my clients and to work with attorneys on the other side or adjusters on the other side and be able to get reasonable resolutions. At one time, I was of the opinion, if you had to go to a jury trial on a personal injury case, then you hadn't done your case right. Now, there will be a lot of jury trial attorneys who will disagree with that. But I remember a conversation I had with, at the time, Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court, who was a plaintiff's attorney. And he was saying, you know, I make sure that I get every dollar, every drop of blood for my client before we go to trial. I'm not saying this right. He said, I get every dollar. And that's what I'm proud of. And I said, I can understand that. I said, but answer me a question, Justice. What if going to jury trial is not the right thing for your client? And he said, I take that into consideration. But, you know, what I learned is nobody wants to go to jury trial unless they absolutely have to. And I think that being able to finesse and develop a strong case on behalf of your client is so important that you develop it the right way so that if and when it comes to mediation, and we didn't have mediation a number of years ago, I think it got to be important maybe 15 years ago. And now, every case you got that's on a jury docket, you got to go to mediation regardless. You know, and you know, I've talked to judges and I say, look, I know my opposing counsel. They have told me they will never settle this case. So why do I have to go to a mediation and add expense to my client that they can't afford? And the judges would always say, well, you know, Terry, I understand what you're saying, but we'll figure that out later. I'll take that into consideration later. So, you know, there are other attorneys who will disagree with me that, you know, and there are cases that should go to jury trial. Most of my cases didn't need that jury trial. The jury trial is best, I think, when you've got the defense that's offering very little and you've got serious claims of injury on the plaintiff's side. Those are the kind of cases that I really think, yeah, you go to trial in those cases. Because either you don't have an option or you've got such an incredibly great case with serious injuries and no liability questions. And the defense is trying to nickel and dime you in terms of their settlement offers. Then you go to a jury trial. Otherwise, you do your best to try and settle it so that people walk away saying, I at least agreed to this settlement. Maybe I'm not happy. And the old adage is that if both sides are unhappy at a mediation, "You've done a good job, Mr. Mediator." And I'm not so sure that that's true all the time, because sometimes both sides walk away saying, "Yeah, this is a good result. I'm glad we did this." So does that answer your question?
It does.
Let me see if there's anything else. I think the most significant contributions to the law were the loss of consortium case and also the commercial free speech case that was in front of Berciaga. So I wasn't the attorney then, but I was the plaintiff. And it ratified the federal case law that said that the state, if they're going to impose rules or restrictions, they have to adequately state what the restriction is or what the rule is that they're trying to develop. The rule has to fit the complained of series of events or activities. And then it has to be done in the least offensive manner. And those are the three principles. That federal law that got reinforced in my case. And I'll tell you, I would never do that again, being a plaintiff, because I actually felt like what it was like to be a plaintiff in a case. And it's not fun.
Well, and I think, isn't that a valuable experience for the lawyer to have?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that I took that and made it part of how I function in the case. My goal is to get the best possible resolution for my client. And if it means settling it at mediation, or sometimes even today with younger attorneys when I was practicing, I said, yeah, we can go to mediation, or we can do it the old way and sit down and talk with one another. And a lot of the younger attorneys said, oh no, that'd probably be all right, but they tell me I gotta go to mediation. Let's see, what else? I think that's it.
Well, great. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I want to appreciate your contributions to the New Mexico legal community and our profession, and wish you all the best going forward.
Well, thank you, Peter. And I really enjoyed this. You know, it's fun to talk about yourself for 2 hours.
Thank you.
But not having done one before and sitting in the chair that you're in, I'm glad that I did this. And it gave me a little bit more in the way of understanding of what it's like to be sitting in this chair as opposed to be sitting in that chair. So thank you, and I hope I helped.
Thank you.
You certainly